Okay, welcome everybody to our 5th module in this mini workshop. So we've just covered the eusporangiate ferns, and now we're going to talk about 2 groups of leptosporangiate ferns. Our first introduction to those ferns that have that leptosporangium that we've talked about a little bit so far. So back to that phylogeny, except now I've covered in red all of the leptosporangiate ferns instead of coloring the eusporangiates. So from this common ancestor, all of these guys are all leptosporangiates. And we'll start off by talking about this one strange group, which is an order of leptosporangiate ferns called the Salviniaceae that are also called sometimes the Heterosporous ferns. And why are they called that? They're called that because they produce on any given individual 2 types of spores. Great big spores called megaspores and little teeny spores called microspores. The megaspores grow into a gametophyte that only ever produces eggs, and the microspores grow into a gametophyte that only ever produces sperm. So someone asked early whether or not a gametophyte can produce eggs or sperm or both. In this lineage, a given gametophyte only produces eggs or sperm, not both, and which it produces is determined by which type of spore it came from. A microspore for sperm and a megaspore for eggs. So a very different evolutionary, way of doing things. Here's what they look like. Very strange looking plants. So here's 3 of the genera. The clover looking one is the genus Marsileaceae. Then there's 2 floating ones, these round ones, which is in the genus Salvinia. And these little branchy ones, which is the genus Azolla. So 2 families of heterosporous ferns, the Salviniaceae and the Marsileaceae. I'll cover those in turn. The Marsileaceae are the water clovers and the pillworts and their relatives. These are all rooted in the ground. So you can see that their rhizome, their stem, from hence the roots come, is in the ground. And then they have their leaves coming up. And in some cases, the leaves are floating. So sometimes the stem is under the water. Mostly they're in the genus Marsileaceae, look like this, the water clovers. Some of them are in Pteridaceae. There's 1 species in Brazil in the genus Ragnolidium. They're very interesting plants. They produce their spores on a highly modified structure called a sporocarp, which is kind of like a hardened little nut. But if you do an anatomical study, you realize that this hardened little nut is itself a modified leaf. So it has all the venation of a leaf. And on the veins, there are clusters of sporangia. And so this is just a highly modified leaf. It obeys all the regular fern rules. It's just very strange looking. So that's the sporocarp. And they're super hard. They can survive droughts. And then when they get exposed to water, they kind of rupture, and they have a special gelatinous stuff that pushes the spores out. Very interesting biology. Here's what they look like. If you drive a little bit interior to Solano County to the Jepson Prairie, which I highly recommend people do if you have not been to the Jepson Prairie Reserve before. It's a beautiful vernal pool. If you go look in the water, you might find these things that look like clovers. These are Marsileaceae. And then if you look on land, right beside those Marsileaceae, you might see this if you look closely, these tiny little curly leaves. And if you dig a bit up and look at the base, you'll find these hardened round structures. So this is Pteridaceae with sporocarps, the other Californian genus in this family. So you can find both Marsileaceae and Pteridaceae locally here. You can even see, in case you thought this was a grass, look, it's got little fiddleheads. So this is a fern leaf with classic fiddlehead development. It just happens to be a linear leaf that looks a lot like grass. Very hard to find until you know what you're looking for. The other family is Salviniaceae. Again, 2 genera. Both of them occur in California to some extent. There's Azolla, the mosquito fern, and Salvinia, water spangles. And I'll introduce those very briefly. So Salvinia is a floating species. It floats right on top of the surface, doesn't root down at all. In fact, it doesn't even have roots. These structures that hang down that look like roots are themselves modified leaves. And so this is a very strange genus that has lost roots, just like Cleolodum has lost roots. So one species in Salvinia is perhaps the most economically damaging invasive species in the world. And how can it be that a little floating fern like this can be ecologically super destructive? Well, because it does this. So here's a lake in Africa that has been completely taken over by Salvinia molesta. So this species was a huge problem. And sort of for a brief tangent, when it first started to explode and just obviously it shuts down all the economy associated with a lake like this, as well as the ecology. It's a severe problem. People were scrambling to figure out what it was. And it turned out that it was a species that had not been described in Western science. We didn't have a scientific name for it. But scientists realized finally that it was a new species and that it originally came from Brazil. And when they went to the native range in Brazil and looked closely at the Salvinia molesta growing there, they saw that it was infected by a little weevil that appeared to only eat this one species. And they introduced this weevil, introduced one invasive species to take care of another one into Africa. And this appears to be a case where this strategy actually worked. And so the weevil has greatly reduced the damaging effects of Salvinia outbreaks. There are, of course, many examples of what we call biocontrol, introducing one species to control another, that have gone horribly wrong. But this appears to be a case where it went quite well. So taxonomists to the rescue in this case, because the first step was to figure out what species it was. Excuse me. The other genus in the Salviniaceae is Azolla. Azolla also floats on the surface, although it has roots. It has these very strange bilobe leaves that are arranged kind of like shingles, alternating. Some species are invasive, some species appear to be rare, although frankly, we really don't know. They're very hard to identify the species. One of the things that's most exciting about them, aside from their taxonomic uncertainties, is that they have a symbiosis with cyanobacteria. And that symbiosis means that they can fix nitrogen. So just like members of the bean family, pulses, legumes can fix nitrogen by a symbiosis with a bacterium, with rhizobia. Azolla can fix nitrogen by this relationship with its cyanobacterium. And it's been used for this reason in agriculture, traditional rice agriculture, for thousands of years as green manure. So here in the bottom left, you can see a farmer who's tilling in the Azolla into their rice paddy. And then on the top, there are two different species of Azolla to give you some idea of some of the variation. And the bottom right, all that red color is floating Azolla on a pond here in California. So it can form huge populations. Just to give a quick sort of local glimpse, here's some iNaturalist records of Azolla for California. You see it's been observed over 1,100 times, mostly across most of the country, most of the state. So really quite common locally. And sure enough, if you go up the hill from UC Berkeley to Lake Ansa in Tilden, right now, you can find a big patch of Azolla. So this is a recent observation from Lake Ansa. And over on the left-hand side, that whole bay that you can kind of see in the center of the photograph is covered with Azolla. And that's the Briones Reservoir, again, about half an hour away from campus. Here's a close-up of the plants growing in Lake Ansa, so you can get a sort of a closer look at what they look like. Really quite beautiful. And I mentioned already that there's some taxonomic confusion. So here's a photograph taken that I took from Point Reyes. And these look, in terms of Azolla, which all look kind of similar, to be quite different. There's these really pinnate ones, and then there's these ones that are more rounded, more bifurcating. And so I wonder whether or not there's multiple species present in California. In fact, we have some evidence that there are, including a species that looks like it's a hybrid species that we don't have a scientific name for. So there's a lot of work to be done, even here in California, in this particular group of ferns. Closing up Azolla, I wanted to just share one last thing. So I already mentioned it fixes nitrogen, which allows it to grow incredibly quickly. And it appears that this growth spurt actually had global ramifications, this fast growing ability, about 50 million years ago. So a long time ago, there was an incursion of fresh water around the North Polar Ocean. I don't know exactly why this happened, but basically it resulted in there being a layer of fresh water floating on top of the salt water of the ocean. And in that fresh water, apparently, it was great habitat for Azolla. There was a huge Azolla bloom, such that over the course of some hundreds of thousands of years, but relatively short geological perspective, that population itself pulled down global carbon dioxide levels to to a huge extent, to like took out half of the carbon out of the air, more or less. And not only did it do that, but that had an immediate consequence in terms of global climate, where it switched the climate out of this sort of hothouse environment into this ice house environment and restore things like polar ice caps and stuff like that. So it seems like Azolla reversed climate change, or did its own climate change, depending on how you want to think about it, 50 million years ago. And so people are very interested in whether or not there's practical applications for it nowadays. Switching out of the Heterosporous water ferns, I want to talk to us briefly about the Pteridaceae, the brake fern family, which is a really phenomenal family. Pteridaceae is a super variable family, so it's hard to describe, except that they never, ever have a true indusium, and they often have a false indusium. So here's an example. The edge of the leaf is curled over. That's a false indusium. Here, the edge of the leaf is kind of curled over. That's a false indusium. The edge of the leaf curl over. That's a false indusium. This is one of those cases where it's the edge of the leaf, but it's really quite modified, but it's still the edge of the leaf. So that's a false indusium as well. Big family, 1,200 species, and perhaps most interesting because it's super ecologically variable. So this family includes species that float, like this one, species that occur in mangroves and brackish water, which no other fern family does, as well as species that have radiated and are super common in the deserts, like this fern here. So the person who said they live in the Mojave, you'll have lots of opportunities to see interesting members of the Pteridaceae. I'll introduce the two major groups that occur in California. The first of which is the adiantoids. This actually includes two big groups within it, adiantum and pteroids, but only adiantum is here in California. It's a very widespread genus. There's 3 species in California, 4 species in California. And they have a very distinctive false indusium, which I can't, did I show a photo? I didn't show a photo. I can describe in greater detail, but it's these little sort of edges of the leaves that have the sporangia actually coming off the false indusium themselves, instead of off the false indusia themselves, instead of off the surface of the leaf. And then there's the calanthoids, another big subclade of the Pteridaceae. These are the desert adapted ones. And they're common in dry habitats in California, with a whole bunch of different genera present. And so here's one of the hairy ones. This is Myriopterus newberry. Here's one of the really thick ones. This is coffee fern, Playa andromedifolia. And here's one of the waxy ones. This is Pentagramma triangularis, a goldback fern. So many species in the Pteridaceae, in this calanthoid group, have evolved different strategies for surviving xeric, dry habitats. And those 3 sort of characteristics I just mentioned are very common approaches that members of this group have evolved. Just to give you a quick overview, so this is a snapshot of how many of the 15 most commonly observed members of the calanthoids in California. So you see a lot of them are quite common and quite commonly observed. A bit biased. These are iNaturalist observations. So these are what people have decided to take photographs of, not necessarily truly reflective of the diversity. And that is Pteridaceae and the Heterosporous water ferns.